Hey everyone, welcome to No Proscenium's Review Crew. This is episode 38, and I'll be your host, Kevin Gossett. I'm the LA Reviews editor for No Proscenium, and on today we have...
Hi there, this is Patrick McLean, the Chicago curator.
And hi there, this is Blake Weil, East Coast curator.
And before we get into it, I'm going to toss to Blake, who's going to talk about book club.
Hey everyone, so I cannot believe it. We are recording this on April 5th, and we are only 1 week away for the next chapter in our exciting book club. We're going to be reading Laura Hall's Planning Your Escape. It combines practical advice for escapers of all skill levels, along with a history of everyone's favorite immersive game that's taken the world by storm. And we would love to have you. In fact, if you pop in on April 12th in the Discord at 8 p.m. Eastern, that is 5 Pacific time, we would be happy to hear your thoughts, and who knows, they might even end up on the No Proscenium Review Crew, like you're going to be hearing about today when we are talking about the amazing discussion we had about last month's book club regarding Snow Crash.
And thanks for that lead-in, Blake. So yeah, today we'll be talking about Snow Crash. This was the first book club entry in the series, and it's an exciting one. I think it's a pretty seminal work for a lot of different reasons, as we'll get into here. So if you're not familiar with it, it was first released in 1992. It's Neal Stephenson's vision of the future, and it's only become more relevant as everyone has talked nonstop about the metaverse for the last few months. And actually, the novel feels more prescient today than maybe it even did 10 years ago. You've got stuff like the metaverse, which is actually a term that Stevenson coined, to the concept of Earth in it, which is, I think we've seen in like Google Earth. You have the gargoyles who are constantly tapped into the internet. You have couriers. You have memes, even in some sense, with like the namshubs and things like that have kind of like gone through people's brains. And I think there's probably even more than that I'm forgetting or have not
like hyperinflation,
hyperinflation,
and a lot of very subtle political stuff that I appreciated.
The horrifying reality of privatization of everything.
The memos in office work.
Oh my god, that depressed me. Oh yeah, we got to talk about that one.
Okay, so if you haven't figured it out yet, audience, you're in for kind of a bummer of an episode as we all fetch about how this book made us cry about the banality of modern life. Ooh, let's dive into this one.
let's dive in. The book is actually a lot of fun, I guess, too. It's the topics are maybe a little depressing, but the book's a fun like action movie with some heavy a drip of Sumerian myth there at periods. But
it's so fun because the characters are paper thin, which really lets you focus on the lore, the world building, and the sort of speculative fiction aspect, the projecting what if, and honestly finding a lot of accuracies. You know, we're just hearing about robotic dog border security tests, which are A, horrific and dystopian and should be shut down, and B, a major plot point in the book.
And yeah, and as with actually a couple of things in this book, when you cram uranium and nuclear material into these things, it goes from horrifying to horrifying but cool.
It's an action movie book. That's kind of a great way to put it.
And on that, because I was rereading parts of it and trying to finish up, there's one point where the book literally like it gets into like a fight sequence, and then it goes. And after that, it was just a chase scene. It doesn't even bother explaining what happens. It just cuts right to it. You know what kind of book you're in. You know what happens, and we'll pick up with Hero a little bit later. So our first discussion topic, I think, is probably the big one that ties it to immersive theater, and that's the metaverse and VR and AR, which I think tie into Snow Crash in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to kick it off to you, Patrick. I haven't heard from you a second. You're our AR, VR expert.
I'll claim to be two of those things. I've never been good at AR, but yeah. So I think what the reason why this was the inaugural choice was because of that digital elephant in the fictional room, that this is where the metaverse as a term comes from. And practically, this is, I know Blake is going to have some slightly different opinions on it, but what I found so mind-blowing here 30 years later, because this is the year, it's a celebratory year in that sense, is how much of the practical functionality of being in VR that this book gets correct in regards to like so many of the specifics of you have this main thoroughfare. Like anyone who is logged on to Altspace VR or gone to VR worlds and things like that, we all know you put on the headset, you log in, you go to like a hub space, sometimes they're private, sometimes they're public, but they're generally like a general access area where then you can go to a different world or go to a different environment by going through a portal or accessing a button, so on and so forth. And that's all in this book. Like the metaverse as it is functionally used in Snow Crash, like there's the big main avenue. So like in this one, what happens is it's hooked up to your computer and it's simply reading your eyes. Like it's almost there, instead of the big hot brick on the front of your face that we're all wearing right now, it is currently just like glasses, and it, you know, puts everything on your eye, and you walk around this big street of this metropolis where then you can turn off and go into these more little private areas. And as of course it's a crowded place, you can move through people, like they disappear and stuff like we experience so constantly. And that's what I found so captivating that Stevenson got right so long ago about the metaverse.
It's funny you bring up what he got right, because for such a bleak book, I also think he got a little bit wrong when it comes to the metaverse and being a little bit too optimistic. One of the things we talked about in the book club discussion that I thought was really striking was how he predicted or imagined metaverse infrastructure as being run by an NGO in order to keep the metaverse free. You could walk down, the main thoroughfare of the metaverse in Snow Crash and see someone whose avatar is giant googly-eyed genitalia. Apparently this is a common gag avatar in the universe. And I almost feel like in a post-net neutrality, post-Facebook staking their flag in the public conception of the metaverse age, there is this almost charming, almost tragic naivete to the idea of, even in the banal corporate future, we can find freedom on the internet.
And yeah, that's very much a piece of, I think, with the rest of the book, which is very into like kind of the hackers are the cool, like they're real cool. The thrashers and the couriers are also real cool. There's kind of this like counterculture, like Gen X vibe that runs through it. And I think probably a lot of people in that era probably did see kind of that more open internet. And that's essentially what the metaverse is in Stevenson's imagining, is like just the internet that you can walk around in. But as we've seen, that's not exactly what has happened with the internet, to Blake's point, for the last 15, 20 years or so, as it's just become kind of more privatized and corporate, and everyone's out for your ad dollars and things like that. And I think actually they Stevenson got that right too, in terms of, I think there's just like pop-ups all over the place, and some of the hackers had like written things so you didn't get that in your face all the time too.
Fun, weird arts imitates life thing. And forgive me if this is a change of subject, but I was just doing a little bit of kind of desk research on Snow Crash and its impact. Do you know that to this day there is an annual recital, I suppose is the best word, of Snow Crash in Second Life? Performance?
No,
I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but they fully reenact Snow Crash in Second Life annually in celebration of its prescience.
That's really funny. And I think Second Life is actually something that was probably spawned off of Snow Crash too, right? I would guess.
It is the most Snow Crash. I honestly feel like Second Life is the promise of Snow Crash much more than Facebook Meta is. Linden Labs, for all their faults and poor business sense, always struck me as having that kind of Gen X-y, hacker chic, laissez-faire approach.
And I'll ask, because maybe there's people at their car cocking their head sideways at the radio. What is Second Life?
Second Life was, I almost want to say it's an MMO about nothing. It's the Seinfeld of MMOs. It was Minecraft before Minecraft. It was also the blockchain before blockchain. It was a virtual world, kind of like the metaverse, in which people could own virtual property, create virtual goods that they could sell for a virtual Second Life currency. That Second Life currency could be explosive in terms of the fact that it was tradable for real dollars, and there was a record within Second Life of your ownership of all your virtual property. And it's since fallen out of favor, mostly just because the digital infrastructure really started to lag behind the tech. But it has diehard fans, and for a while, all the cool companies, just like in Snow Crash, had an outpost in Second Life. You could go to a concert of an artist. I think Nine Inch Nails used to do stuff in Second Life. You could go and try on digital fashions on your avatar of a real brand's actual fashion line.
Yeah, and and I want to bring that around to that sense of a point that it's actually yours, Blake, that when we were having our conversation in Discord, is that the metaverse in Snow Crash definitely is of its time in the sense that it's very informational. I would say that the metaverse of today, or most VR experiences, are a lot more fun and vibrant, where I'm not sure. I know this was my first time reading it. I could not help imagining everything in the metaverse in Snow Crash looked like it wasn't from Tron, which was also, I went and looked up, is 10 years before this book. And I just imagined the world of Snow Crash's metaverse being one of very much of like lines and the primary colors and some other kind of distinctions in the very public areas, at least, but very unimaginative. Would you guys agree with that? Was that ever your thoughts or your takes?
I think yes and no. A little bit more in rereading it too. I think, as Blake and I think Michael Anderson pointed out on the Discord chat about it too, a lot of what happens in Snow Crash in the metaverse is they conduct business of some sense. Like people meet up there. The Black Sun, which is like a big club, is where a lot of like business people meet and do business. But even within that constraints, I think there's a lot more freedom to like be who these people are. Like I think it talks about Heroes Clothes and obviously a sword fighting program, and the way that different people fit in to the metaverse lets them be a little bit more personality driven. I think when you're out on the street, it's a little different, but I did imagine just kind of like a virtual cityscape. I think in any time I've kind of read it or gone back to reread it.
It's so funny you say it allows you to be more yourself, because, and forgive me as bringing my perspective into this, I found the book almost punishingly straight. I feel like, especially in a post-Matrix age in which there is this acknowledgement and embracing of queer possibility within cyberspace, there's this very, like, on the one hand, everyone is being more themselves in the metaverse, but no one's trying to be someone different. No one has an identity that is distinctly severed from who they are in real life. Yes, Hero is the coolest hacker on Earth, but it's not that this is a manifestation of his personality that can only exist in the metaverse. In the real world, he is the coolest, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous to people who haven't read the book, he's the coolest pizza driver, he drives the coolest car, he's the best sword fighter on Earth, he can infiltrate floating sea fortresses. Like, there's almost a rejection of what I think was present in the early internet from day one, which is the bifurcation of the online self and the meat world self.
And yeah, I think that's a really fair criticism of it. I think maybe it's from its time or whatever, but yeah, I think that's probably one of the parts that hasn't aged as well, where you don't see as much. You're right. That is very like, it's very straight, or very kind of like a fairly narrow idea of what is cool, which is interesting because it operates so much on like these action movie tropes, and it maybe fits in that kind of late 80s, early 90s like vibe. I don't really
the
know
overwhelming techno orientalism also doesn't age particularly great.
Yeah,
but
that was not great.
For a much more nuanced criticism of that, may I kindly suggest anyone else talking about Snow Crash?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing, though, to maybe like in the sense of the book in general. I was actually kind of shocked at large. I had gone in with the assumption whether I created it falsely or just kind of just I read the back of my jacket, and I'm pretty sure whatever the blurb on the back of my copy of Snow Crash was not the book I read. But I went in thinking this was going to be a very timeless piece, that it was going to be it was going to be much more prevalent on the regular, both narratively with ideas and so much and so forth. And this was something that came up at the end of our book conversation. Noah was there, and Chris, whose last name I forgot because I'm not looking at my notes. I apologize. Both read this book when it came out, and they were very helpful in reminding that, like, so much I think of the culture found in that book is of its time, right? Like, for good or bad, as we glossed over very quickly to let people discuss among themselves. But I thought that was kind of very shocking for me, and it was very interesting to discover that when reading it.
So, changing the subject again briefly, one of the big things that kind of became a huge topic of discussion outside the metaverse, but also immersive adjacent, was the concept of the burbclave within Snow Crash. These autonomous, self-governing uh, little pockets of franchise suburbs that exist as almost their own version of a curated reality. And these can range from incredibly standard Stepford wife suburban fantasy to kind of the horrifyingly racist, privatized apartheid state of New South Africa. And I I had the misfortune of reading Snow Crash the exact week that Disney announced their story living initiative. Uh, and I got a little bit nauseous and had to lie down for a while after those chapters. What were your guys' thoughts on that? Or if any of you want to elaborate on this Disney tract housing nightmare.
So I think I'll kind of seek into that. So I think one of the things that's always stood out to me is I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, which is where a significant portion of the book takes place. I grew up in the San Fernando suburbs in Reseda specifically. So you can kind of like see this like twisted version of like 90s Valley suburbia where it has this, it's not that I don't think the Valley has ever been like the typical suburbia. It has like kind of a weirder edge to it. And it's a little bit more diverse here than I think in some states, just because it's Southern California. So I think that's always been part of this book. For the appeal of this book to me too is like it takes place where I grew up and spent a lot of time. So it's always fascinating to just kind of like see how that's been reinterpreted. And then, as I think to your point, as with the metaverse, I think the Disney, what are they, story living? I can't remember the name. It's so bizarre.
Disney has their 7 words:
Yeah.
story, dream, wish, magic, enchanted, etc., etc.
Yeah, so I think it's such like a bizarre twisted version of even Stevenson's twisted version of like what reality he was thinking it was going to be, where it is like it's not your standard suburbia. It's even like more away from reality than like his thinking was.
Well, I'm going to push back in this sense because I've actually found it very vividly real and accurate because I grew up in suburban Kansas, and the amount of gated communities I could drive by where there was for lack of a better descriptor, security guard, used very loosely that term, in a golf cart moving around the grounds around the things and stuff like that. And why on God's green earth the suburban Kansas needed so many gated communities, actually gated communities with fences and all of that? No clue, no idea. But I'm like, I'm from that America. That America existed. He got it right. for some reason they're like paranoid.
He 100% got it right, but where I think this dystopian story living concept pushes it kind of one step further from me, away from just sort of the classist banality of suburban life into like true dystopian disgust, is the idea of, I guess, the curated reality is that layer that Stevenson puts over the gated community. That there are a million different gated communities for whatever you want your life to be, and whoever you want to interact with, and whoever you don't want to interact with. And I think, I hate to say it, but beyond, the mindless ad copy talking about how story living will have signature Disney touches, I think it's the name that really rubs me the wrong way, because there is an implicit promise that you are giving authorial curatorship of your life to a corporation. And if anything, Noah brought up the best point, that it really reminded him of The Villages, that nightmarish chain of adult living residential Floridian housing that invented whole fake histories to its town, so that you didn't even have to live in the real history of Florida. There is this overwhelming sense of, not to go full simulation and simulacra, we're entering into more and more mirrors of reality. There is a reason why Frontierland is cited as one of the ultimate examples of simulacra.
Yeah, and I think maybe that speaks to the kind of wider rejection of what reality and like trying to live in the story. I think as that's kind of the point you've been trying to make. And yeah, it's bizarre. And I think, yeah, to Patrick's point about, I guess, that, and Blake's yours as well, that this is, the Burbclaves in Snow Crash are very like isolated, and they've chosen to live with these people in this version of their world. And that's maybe like the story living ones feel so much more like that, but also bizarre, because it's not even,
Well,
I
it's
don't
just
know,
like
you're Disney, man. Like, it's weird.
But if I can
yeah,
gossip
you're
for 2 seconds.
giving yourself over to it. Like
Yeah.
it isn't like in the Burbclave where, at least in the world of Snow Crash, for better or worse, you could make the argument that those people living there, this kind of accidentally happened. They just wanted to live in a safer place, or they moved up in the world, or things and stuff like that. And that's just how they kind of found themselves in this Burbclave and things like accident. Where this Disney comparison is like, that's a
Then
choice.
it's
Like
aspirational.
yeah.
Yes, that's what it is. Well, and I think even his version of like a corporatized America is like the Mafia is a major franchise. There's like the Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong area. It's not truly like these corporations have taken over, and maybe that's why it also feels like so strange. It's like that people want to affiliate themselves with these brands so much. And I think we've seen that a lot lately. Anyways,
Well, in conclusion of that thought, the project's doomed to failure anyway. I mean, Google Salton Sea, everyone. Like, they're building it next door to the most infamous California ecological disaster development attempt of all time. This is an inevitable turkey. Disney has never made a housing project work, and so we can at least rest easy knowing that.
Well, and while we're talking about in the world of Snow Crash, like reality, which in the book is capitalized on the regular, I really want to. The other thing I very much enjoyed about this was Stevenson's criticism of society and having gotten other things right. PT's mom, who works for the federal government, goes to an office. The earlier mom gets there, the better, because that reflects well for potentially going up in the career. You find the first available desk that has no personal items. And by desk, I mean simply a space where there's room for the screen and the keyboard. There's no personal effects, and you do your job in those, and there's no cubicles even. It's a wide open space where it's just a bunch of these little tiny tables with the computers on top of each other, next to each other, things and stuff like that. And I worked in that office for 5 years of my life before the pandemic. That it was like I never left, and I was going back into the office just like it was yesterday. And I think that was a really well done thing he did. And there was other ones too, but were there any for you guys that really resonated? I have one more, but I'm curious what you guys think.
I think the Office one stands out to me too, because it's like, here it's a nightmarish like open office plan scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And that's being like something that's like celebrated today, right? It's like, oh, we're like, it's doing an open office. You can like sit wherever you want and do whatever. And it's like, it's really uncomfortable to actually do that in practice. Or I find it uncomfortable. I like having my own little space if I'm going into the office, which is nice. So yeah, I think that was one of them. And then actually, I'm curious, what is your second one?
My other second one was in regards to the hyperinflation at work in the book. In Snow Crash's reality in the real world, money means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. People are walking down with like $1 million bills and just throwing them against each other, and inflation can turn in the midst of a conversation and things be more expensive. And I thought it was honestly I think possibly my most favorite part of this book was when they were talking about hyperinflation and the new dollar bills, and that people were paying for things using one of the higher currency bills, which was referred to as a Gipper. And I'm like, that's brilliant criticism. I am here for this. And it was a lot of stuff like that in the reality. And that's why I was curious if you guys resonated, any others you found and resonated with you.
There were a lot of things that resonated with me. One of the things that I found, for all people think of Neuromancer as really, articulating, the future of American urban sprawl. I feel like urban sprawl is not nearly as much the reality I lived in as the horrible suburban sprawl of Snow Crash, that wall to wall it is franchised everything, that there is not one stretch of really remote land that anyone is ever occupying in Snow Crash. Even when someone's going on a huge road trip up through Oregon, they're stopping at like plastic inflatable rest stops that
Which are just Alaska too, right? Like it's like way out there.
Yeah, and there's
they're pop-up
as someone
cities.
who has driven on US 1 as far between New Jersey and Miami, and seen no functional difference between what your way of life living on US 1 would be between the two. I feel like that was a really sharp but also subtle criticism.
Yeah, and I think that's a good one. Mine, I think, would be like the idea of the couriers, right? Like, which I think in cities they had like bike couriers and meal delivery like that. And even I think when I first read it, it was God, almost 15 years ago. Like the couriers weren't as much a thing as you have Grubhub, you have all these like delivery services now, which is functionally what the courier, like a kind of more boring version of the couriers. They don't get to deliver cool stuff on their skateboards. It's just like people kind of enslaved to these apps delivering things in their car, and like it's like
or weird... even more extreme, that like the novel opens with Hero having to make a delivery, his pizza delivery, in less than 30 minutes. And if the pizza is not delivered to the person who ordered it in that time, the head of the corporation of, I forget the name of the pizza place, Uncle Enzo's Pizza, whatever it specifically is going to fly out and meet this person and apologize and profusely just be caught up in the situation. But like, it has to be there in 30 minutes. Whatever you ordered, you must get it. And if you don't, you are entitled to complain and can get reparations and damages for getting that pizza 1 second over 30 minutes.
And then I
See,
think because it's an arm of the mafia too, it's also implied the deliberator that misses that window will also be killed. So extra fun.
Oh, yeah.
It's so funny you bring that up because I was just listening to a podcast on the history of dominoes. And as people who we didn't read this when the book first came out, this was even more specific a commentary than you think after the numerous lawsuits that Domino's introduction of the 30-minute or less delivery promise created wildly unsafe conditions of reckless driving and incredibly aggressive road warrior pizza delivery men.
Hey, wait, that sounds familiar. Sounds like that was in Snow Crash.
I just read that somewhere.
No, and Liz, History of Dominoes is wild. Strongly urge everyone to read up on that. Lots of corporate intrigue. There's a murder attempt at one point. It's a really crazy story from start to finish.
Speaking of crazy things, this is a terrible segue, especially when everyone knows where this is going to be going. I had one struggle. I struggled through consistently one aspect of this book as a criticism that essentially could equate to that could have been an email. The concept that there's a secret Sumerian language embedded in all of us that could be triggered using guttural chanting to enslave someone. Sure, I am all here for that. That's the big spoiler alert. That's the big kind of thing that everyone's chasing, is to crack that code and then either prevent it from happening or the antagonists want to enslave everyone. But they talk about how that's possible for over 100 pages of a 500-page book.
It was an aggressive few chapters. I liked that they tried to make it at least mildly more intriguing by introducing a character who is sort of literally the embodiment of an information dump, who is living Wikipedia.
He's the librarian. That's the character. That's the character's name. It's just a librarian.
And there's a subtle humor to his character, but by that same token, I did not need 20 pages of Hero going, that Sumerian circle and staff kind of look like a 1 and 0, don't they?
What?
Really makes you think.
Binary? Huh.
Well, and I think that's like, once again, like per my comment about the timelessness of this book, like here in 2022, it is not at least for me, it's actually incredibly easy for me, but I'm sure many people out there, it is not a hard sell to believe that culture existed outside of the Bible, before the Bible, in a very specific place in the Middle East that we all come from, and that we're all of one people, and that ain't like history itself. Religion is written by the victors. I've been on that train for several years now. I've been all for it. As I said, I didn't need 100 pages to convince me today of that. I'm like, yeah, this is not new. This is something we actually all, I think, regularly talk about.
And so I think, yeah, that's why if someone's going to bounce off this book, it is specifically that section. And then actually the section a little near the end too, where they just kind of continue to explain it. And I think there's some interesting concepts there, but it straight up turns into just an info dump of like, here's all the Sumerian myth that Neal Stephenson had been reading when he was like writing this book, and how he's going to get it in there. I think the kind of part where I find it interesting is like, in a way, this I think feels like memes and like kind of the way internet language sprung up and then has been reinvented God knows how many times since. Like I think specifically of the way the like that one image from The Onion of like the worst person you know made a point or whatever. Like people just post that image now without the headline, and it means something. And maybe that's like going back to like signs and signifiers and parts and all that. But that's also, I think, something that makes its way in here, and maybe that has some relevance to today's internet. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know if I'm off base there.
I know what you're saying, like for sure that there's a distinction, and there's a point that Stevenson is making that lexicology changes and evolves, but can also become simpler, and that there can be shorthands within certain languages and in ways we all can communicate. And I think that equates once again to the point you're making with like memes and things like that. That I'm sure all of us have sent. I'm sure everyone listening, regardless of what time it is here past April 5th, that you've sent at least one meme today to someone in the work Slack or via text or wherever. But it's just buried. It's just frankly buried under a bunch of very dry text.
That's fair, because it reads straight up like a Wikipedia article, because that's kind of what it is.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And I almost, maybe it was more thrilling in a pre-Wikipedia age. Maybe the idea that you could just summon someone from the ether to explain whatever you wanted to you was a conceptually interesting enough starting point that we could deal with 100 pages of that content.
In 1992, there's probably not a lot of people like challenging the legitimacy of the Bible or how so many religious texts came to be, and really taking it back to look there. Like, I'm sure in 1992, these were some really fresh takes. Unfortunately, today they are not, or they're more readily discussed or have been discussed further. That's all.
And so in the last few minutes here, I think we've kind of talked about like a lot of like the concepts that are present in the book. Is there any just kind of like parts that really stand out or have stood out in like previous reads, in terms of whether it's fun or dumb or whatever, really?
I almost want to say it's a fun read. There's some good fight scenes. But there are books that are important, books that are good, and books that are both. And I think that this might be an important book more than it's a great book.
Yeah, that said, honestly, other than the pages of Sumerian text, I was generally involved and I was engaged with it. I think another thing that's kind of interesting to talk about that was brought up in the conversation on Discord that we were having is Neal Stephenson as a writer himself. In regards to that, another kind of, I think it's very valid compared to maybe even the Sumerian thing, which we could take or leave. You might bounce off it or you might dig it. It might be a fresh idea to you because you've never engaged with it. But this book just ends. Like both.
It doesn't even end, it stops.
Yeah. And I think, and at first because I've never read any Stevenson before this, any of his work. So I actually thought this was maybe like first book syndrome, in the sense of like great idea gets picked up and things like that. But this was, I think, the third book that he had, fiction book that he had written and had published. And it was a comment many people made was that like, some of this was apparently still a problem to this day. And and unfortunately, I think that's just the other thing that people might bounce off of, is that it can be very distressing to read a book this long and just have it stop. But I will say, that said, I was always caught up in everything. When there was action, when there was mysteries to be solved, I was there with Hero and PT, because I think is very much equally her story, if not more, because it does stop with her. And I thought that was kind of really engaging with that. And I think I did appreciate how,
so I was gonna say, maybe to kind of like jump off that. I've always found Stevenson to be like a compelling writer in like the like minute to minute of a book. Like Snow Crash is fun. It's like, it's a very quick read. It's very snappy. It's funny. Like he carries it through. And I think when it gets to the end, he's done such a good job of so many of the other pieces that when it gets to the end, it's like abrupt. It's like, what the fuck just happened? Like
right. There's no more dramatic. We've solved the dramatic problem. what more do you want? Like it's over, it's done in that sense.
It's done.
It's a take, and I've seen other people do it, right? I want to be very clear. It's not like this is the first book I've ever encountered with that. But that said, like I think it is a worthwhile read, and there's a lot of subtle stuff, like the thing with the Gipper, like that there's a currency with the Gipper, and there's a few other ideas that he so subtly layers in there as a major criticism or a thought-provoking idea that I think should be applauded and is worth celebrating.
And I think we didn't even get into like the concept of snow crash in the book, which is maybe one of those ideas, how it's like kind of a drug on both the virtual side and in the real life side, and kind of like the way it weaves into the religion of L. Bob Reif and the Reverend Waynes and all that stuff. Like there's a lot of like concepts there that I think he gets into in interesting ways and finds like a hook to hook them back
to interconnect them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And yeah, because that's what I mean. We've talked about like how the street and the metaverse provides all this information and the data, and like that's really what the virus is too. It's like based in this data and the way people transmit information to one another. In terms of snow crash in the real world, it's through blood and through data and like bits on the internet, right? Like,
yeah, that the worlds aren't that terribly different in many ways. Like a world of ones and zeros is as breathtakingly expansively beautiful, but also as equally deadly dangerous as the real one of biology and things and stuff like that. Like it there's very little difference between reality and the metaverse, that they are a reflection of one another.
I guess in summation, that brings us back to immersive theater more broadly. If we're agreeing with his thesis, Stevenson's, that reality is perceptual, then this is why we go to immersive theater, because it lets us live, perhaps with not all the danger of quote unquote the real world, but it lets us experience different lives and different ways of being with all the texture that can bring along with it. And it doesn't always do that, but when it succeeds, we do have this experience that has the potential for real transformation because it has the same fundamental stuff as reality.
I think we're actually going to leave it there then. I think that's a great point to end on. So thank you, Blake and Patrick. And we're going to wrap it up now. So as always, No Proscenium is a labor of love. Everyone on staff who you hear on podcasts like this and read on the site are volunteers. You can support this work by donating to the No Proscenium Patreon. Even $2 or $5 a month helps. And if you're enjoying Review Crew or the main No Proscenium podcast, you can also support us by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you hear podcasts. That helps us out, and it's nice to hear from people if you like the show. So on behalf of the Review Crew, signing off,